universally what happens, but you have to almost admit like, okay, I'm stuck.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's why in most religious systems, humility is stressed, right? Because humility says, I have a problem and I'm stuck. And humility says, whatever I'm doing isn't working and therefore I'm wrong. And so, like, as soon as you say that, and you don't have to get metaphysical about it except
And in
for
my case, I
metaphysics of thought.
not only say it, but I'm usually weeping
Mhm,
in
mhm,
deep pain
mhm.
and laying on the ground
Right.
going, why?
Well,
What help?
then you know you're really saying it.
Yeah. Then you mean
Yeah.
it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Right. And so, what you do in some sense psychologically is you admit to yourself that your current frame of reference is faulty.
Mhm.
And then you start opening the door to a different kind of thinking, which is more creative thinking. It's more lateral thinking. You think, well, I'm wrong, but that's not necessarily a problem because I could be right if I thought some other way. Well, that's great. Often it works.
Yeah.
And there's almost no end to the utility of trying to figure out which ways that you're wrong,
Yeah.
because there's lots of them. And every time you discover one, then you don't have to be quite so wrong anymore. That's a really good deal.
Yeah.
One of the things I was trying to stress in 12 Rules for Life, and also in this first book I wrote, Maps of Meaning, is that you need to decide at some point in your life whether you're more in love with what you know or what you don't know. And people tend to be in love with what they know because you don't want to have that shaken and challenged, and it's not surprising. But the problem with that is that you don't know enough unless everything's going perfectly for you.
Mhm.
And everything around you set in order perfectly. It's like your ignorance outweighs your knowledge. It's like, so you should make friends with what you don't know.
And even what you know, you'll forget. And you'll need to like reimagine that in a different way and use a different metaphor and understand it. Because, in that deep prayer, in the same story, I'm in New York in this hotel room, everything's gone to hell, and I just can't find my way out. And the message that came through, without getting into the specific details, was the sun does not measure its light by the shadows that it casts. And I never thought of that metaphor like that,
So
And
did you?
so
what
basically
happened was,
I was measuring my own worth and my own validity as a person by the external things that were happening,
right.
the consequences of my acts, like what was going on.
Yep.
And I was using that to create my own hell of unworthiness and my own hell.
Mhm.
And then so that
Right.
metaphor came in, like the sun does not measure its light by the shadows that it casts.
That's a hell of a poetic statement, that.
Right.
Yeah, it's a good one.
And I was like, oh shit.
Mm.
And then from there, that trigger, so this was a 5-day descent into hell that kind of crescendoed in this moment in the hotel room. And then that one statement, which I'd never imagined that before, it seemed greater
that's a good one.
than I had anything that I could think of at the moment.
Oh yeah, it's a good one. It's
Then-
really poetically put.
Yeah, then led me out, and that's led me through since then.
Right.
Honestly,
It's also not self-evident what it means.
Right.
It has to be unpacked. I have a
Yeah.
chapter about that, right? Which is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today.
Mm.
It's the same basic idea,
Mhm.
right? Is that you have to get your markers for success right.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you can end up in the situation you described, which is that, like, there's always people out there who are doing far better than you on pretty much anything you want to imagine. And if all you're doing is seeing yourself in their reflected light, let's say, then it's going to be pretty damn dismal. But it's not a good comparison, because you shouldn't just compare. Well, first of all, there's danger in just comparing yourself to others, period, because they're not you, and God only knows what struggles they had to undertake to get to where they were, or what burdens they're currently carrying that you're not aware of. You just don't know any of that. But you can certainly contrast yourself with yourself, and that's a lot better. And that's also a great
It's
way.
the only way.
It is the only way. Well, it's also the only way of really measuring anything approximating proper improvement. You can actually tell when you're a little better than you were yesterday.
Right.
So, and you can actually do that. That's another thing that's so interesting about it, is that you can actually make yourself a little better in some way, pretty much. Well, I don't know if it's at every moment, but you can certainly do it every day.
Well, it can go 2 steps forward and 1 step back. It can go in this kind of spiraling, but as long as you're going from low left to top right on the graph, with
That's
the
right.
volatility
That's right.
of the market,
absolutely.
Which will certainly go up and down.
Yeah.
I think that's one
And
of
which is also a necessary thing to factor in.
Sure.
Right, because you should. And that's also part of not gripping yourself too tightly or not putting the constraints on too hard. Is that you're exactly right. You're moving up to the top right hand corner, but you do it like a thermostat. It's back and forth, looking for that center line. You have to overshoot on both sides to find it. So you have to allow yourself a certain latitude for error. And that's a useful thing to know too. One of the things I tell people when they're trying to develop a vision for their life or an implementable plan is, Make a bad plan. Like, make the best one you can, but don't get obsessive about it. It's like, make a
Yeah.
plan, implement it. You'll figure out when you implement it why it's stupid. Exactly. And then you can fix it a little bit. And then you can fix it a bit more, and then you can fix it a bit more. And then eventually you get a good plan, even if you
And you
start
have
with
to,
something
but
that's
you have
not
to
good.
do it hard. You have to like go. You know what I mean? And I think a lot of people make mistakes is because they'll have a plan and they'll halfway do it.
Mm.
And you don't learn. Like a failure or success is both success
Mhm.
because you learn from both of those.
Mm.
What you don't learn shit from
Is staying.
is going part of the
Yeah.
way and having that fallback position of, well, I didn't really try.
There's
it.
a there's
didn't
a
really
there's
go
a
for it.
statement in Revelation. It's a very strange book. Christ comes back as the judge. Now, Jung commented about that, Carl Jung, and he said, look, the Christ in the Gospels is very, very merciful. And the problem with that, but he's an ideal. And an ideal is always a judge because you compare yourself with your ideal. So the ideal has to have a judgmental element. And he said that was missing in the Gospels. And that's why Revelations was tapped on to the end of the Bible. And Christ comes back as a judge. And one of the things he says is, if you were neither hot nor cold, I'll spit you out of my mouth. And he actually uses, it's a word that refers to vomit. So it's a disgust phrase, but it's exactly relevant to that. It's like, so the people who are judged most harshly aren't the ones who make the worst mistakes or who do the best things. It's the ones that stay in the middle and never commit themselves,
Yeah.
who want to have it both ways, right? And so that's a hell of a thing to know, is that it's okay to fail as long as you're in it, as long as you're all in, say.
Totally.
And the more all in you are, the better, and the failures are okay. But hedging your bets, no.
Doesn't get you anywhere.
No.
And that's something I've been fortunate to learn from some of these top elite performers. Like we'll have someone like Tim Kennedy in here who's,
Mhm.
tip of the spear in the special forces, also top UFC fighter, just top performer across the board. And he'll talk about, when I go to something, I try to fail as quickly as possible.
Mhm.
I try to push myself to that point where either my body breaks down or the system breaks down or something goes, so I know.
Mhm.
And the longer I can push that out, maybe that's a really good plan if I haven't been able to fail quite yet, but he sees that as a goal almost.
Well, I think one of the things I learned when I was in my 20s was how much work I could do. Because when I was in graduate school, I basically worked myself to the point of exhaustion because I got curious. It's like, well, how much work can I do?
What is my
It's
capacity?
a complicated question, right? Because it's like, how much work can I do today? But then, well, it's not just today. It's a succession of days. If I work this hard, will I wear myself out in a
borrowing
week or a
tomorrow
month?
from
Mhm,
tomorrow
right,
to pay for today.
right. So you got to figure that out. But I think when you're young, I think it's really something to do in your 20s is to push yourself to your limit so that you know where it is, and then you back off a bit so that it can be sustainable. Because you don't want to like die when you're 27, even though there's a romance about that, and lots of people, even successful people, do that. It's not a really very good plan.
No.
So you want to push yourself to that extreme and see what you can manage, and then pull back so you can iterate it. But you don't know where that is unless you push yourself past what you can bear, really.
Even when you're in an indulgent situation, like let's say you're having drinks, there's a certain point where the return on having those extra 2 more drinks at the end of the night is going to cause an irreparable amount of pain that's going to come the next day. And so it's not worth it. So even these lessons that you apply to the positive aspects of life, you can also apply to these other simple things like, okay, at this point, these tequilas are going to make me maybe feel this much better. And tomorrow they're going to make me feel this much worse. I'm not doing it, and that's like, I think, a wisdom that you get, just by applying. And it's like, I guess it's that kind of like arithmetic. It's like almost doing math at the end. Like, all right, this much pleasure for how much pain at the end.
Well, it's also
this much
part
work productivity now for how much recovery I'm going to need later. And then you can start to kind of
I think that
pace.
is partly wisdom, because one of the things that I've been there's lots of different ways to interpret the world, and you can maybe even make a case that there's an endless number of ways to interpret the world. And the problem with that is that it kind of disorients you in terms of what you should be doing. But just because there's a very large number of ways to interpret the world doesn't mean there's a very large number of productive, meaningful, and sustainable ways to interpret the world. And one of the things you do have to do is figure out how you can conduct yourself today so that you don't upset the apple cart in a week or a month or a year, right? Because you're playing an iterating game. One of the things I often tell my clients, and this is a really useful thing to know too, there's a lot of emphasis in the New Testament, especially in the Sermon on the Mount, on paying attention to the day. something you also see a bit in Buddhism, to sort of focus
That's
on
what I
the
wrote
moment.
it's my book, Own the Day, Own Your Life.
Right, right,
You
right,
know?
right. Exactly.
Focus on the
Exactly.
day.
Yeah.